December 3rd, 1944, the North Atlantic. Elizabeth pressed her face against the cold metal railing of the transport ship, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, dark and violent under gray skies. She had worked in a German supply depot, doing laundry and filing papers, nothing more. Now she was a prisoner of war, sailing toward a country she had only heard about in whispers and propaganda. Around her, other women gripped the rails with white knuckles, their eyes searching the horizon for something familiar. But there was nothing familiar left. Everything they had known was behind them, sinking below the curve of the earth. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you're interested in hearing more untold stories from World War II, stories that reveal the human side of history, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. And tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. It's fascinating to see how far these forgotten voices can reach across time and borders. The women had been told they were being moved for processing. They expected another camp, another interrogation room, another cold building somewhere in France or England. Instead, the guards had loaded them onto trucks, then trains, then finally this ship. No one explained where they were going. Elizabeth watched the American soldiers moving across the deck with calm efficiency. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply worked, checking cargo, adjusting ropes, scanning the horizon. It unsettled her more than anger would have. These men moved like the war was routine. And in that moment, staring at the endless gray water, Elizabeth realized something that made her stomach tighten with fear and strange relief. She realized that for these Americans the war really was routine. They had never lived under its shadow the way she had. The journey across the Atlantic took 9 days. The ship rolled and pitched through winter storms, and many of the women became violently seasick. Elizabeth spent most of the voyage in the lower deck, crammed into a converted cargo hold with 30 other women. The air smelled of salt, rust, and vomit. Metal bunks lined the walls 3 high. At night, the hull groaned and creaked as waves slammed against the sides. Elizabeth lay awake listening to the sound, wondering if the ship would break apart. She had never been on water before, had never been farther than 50 kilometers from her hometown. Now she was crossing an ocean toward a continent that felt more like a myth than a place. During the day, when the weather allowed, guards brought small groups of women up to the deck for air. Elizabeth used those moments to study the Americans. She noticed their uniforms were clean, well-fitted, and showed no signs of wear. Their boots were solid, not repaired with scraps or cardboard inserts, like the German soldiers she had seen. The guards carried themselves without the exhaustion she had grown accustomed to seeing in men who had lived through years of war. They looked rested. They looked fed. It was a small detail, but it told her more than any propaganda ever had. Rumors spread through the hold like wildfire. Some women whispered that America was untouched by bombing, that cities stood intact and lights burned at night without fear. Others claimed the food was so plentiful that even prisoners ate meat every day. Elizabeth wanted to believe it, but belief felt dangerous. Hope had become a luxury she couldn't afford. She had learned to expect the worst, to prepare for hunger, cold, and chaos. Anything better than that would be a surprise. So she kept her expectations low and her observations sharp. On the 7th day, a translator came below deck and spoke to the women through a German-speaking liaison. He explained that they were bound for the United States, that they would be processed as prisoners of war, and that they would be assigned to camps where they would work until the war ended. The announcement was met with stunned silence. America felt impossibly far away. Elizabeth tried to picture it and failed. All she could imagine was more wire fences, more guards, more uncertainty. She had no reference point for a place untouched by war. When land finally appeared on the horizon, the women crowded the railings again. Elizabeth pushed forward until she could see. She expected a coastline scarred by war, perhaps docks filled with military equipment and soldiers moving under the tension of imminent threat. Instead, she saw a port that looked organized, clean, and astonishingly calm. Large cranes moved cargo with mechanical precision. Trucks lined up in neat rows, their engines idling smoothly. Workers in uniforms moved without urgency, without fear, without looking over their shoulders. There were no bombed-out buildings, no rubble, no signs of destruction. The port looked like it had never known war at all. Elizabeth felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't fear. It was the sudden, overwhelming realization that the war she had lived through had not touched this place. These people worked normal shifts, went home to intact houses, slept without air raid sirens. They had routine. They had stability. They had a world that still made sense. And she had forgotten that such a world could even exist. A guard spoke through the translator, instructing the women to prepare for disembarkation. They would be taken through processing, assigned identification numbers, and moved to their designated camp. The tone was informational, almost bureaucratic. Elizabeth listened carefully, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had been told. Germany had called America weak, divided, unprepared for war. But the port below her told a different story. It told a story of capacity, of resources, of a nation that could wage war on the other side of the world without breaking its own infrastructure. It was the most terrifying thing she had seen since her capture. The gangway lowered with a metallic clang. Elizabeth followed the line of women down onto solid ground. Her legs wobbled after days at sea, but she forced herself to walk steadily. She didn't want to appear weak. Around her, American personnel directed the prisoners toward a row of buses. Everything moved with clockwork efficiency. No one shouted. No one shoved. The guards simply pointed, gestured, and waited for compliance. Elizabeth climbed onto the bus and sat near a window. As the vehicle pulled away from the dock, she stared out at the passing streets. The buildings were intact. The roads were paved. People walked casually, carrying bags, talking, laughing. It felt like watching a film from before the war. Except it wasn't before the war. It was happening now in real time while Europe burned. The bus drove for nearly an hour before reaching the camp. Elizabeth watched the landscape change from urban to rural. She saw farms with painted barns, fields that looked tended and productive, houses with lights burning in the windows. Everything looked maintained. Nothing looked desperate. By the time the bus stopped in front of a guarded gate, Elizabeth's understanding of the war had shifted. She had thought both sides were suffering equally, that America was struggling just as Germany was. But America wasn't struggling. America was thriving. And that meant Germany had already lost. The camp was surrounded by fences topped with wire, but the grounds inside looked clean and orderly. Long wooden barracks stood in rows, painted a dull green. Paths were marked with gravel. A flagpole stood near the entrance, the American flag snapping in the wind. Guards stood at intervals, rifles slung over their shoulders, watching but not threatening. Elizabeth filed off the bus with the others and was directed into a large processing building. Inside, American personnel sat at tables with typewriters, folders, and forms. The women were separated into lines, and the process began. When Elizabeth reached the front of her line, a young officer asked her name. He spoke slowly, enunciating each word. A translator repeated the question in German. Elizabeth answered quietly, giving her full name, her age, her hometown. The officer typed each answer onto a form, the keys clicking in a rapid final rhythm. She was asked about her work, her education, her family. She answered honestly because she saw no benefit in lying. The questions were asked without malice, without anger. They were just collecting information. It felt less like an interrogation and more like being cataloged. After the interview, she was handed a metal identification tag, stamped with a number. The officer explained through the translator that this number would be used for all camp records, work assignments, and meal distributions. Elizabeth held the tag in her palm, feeling its weight. She had become a number in a system she didn't understand, in a country she had never imagined visiting. But the system itself felt solid. It felt organized. It felt like it would continue functioning, whether she resisted or complied. So she clipped the tag to her shirt and moved to the next station. At the supply table, she was given a uniform: sturdy canvas trousers, a button-up shirt, a jacket, and a pair of boots. The fabric was rough but clean, and the boots were new. She was also handed bedding, 2 wool blankets, a pillow, and a thin mattress cover. Everything smelled faintly of soap and storage. Elizabeth accepted the items without comment, but inside she felt a flicker of confusion. In Germany, everything had been reused, patched, stretched as far as possible. Here, new supplies were issued without hesitation. It suggested abundance on a scale she couldn't fully grasp. The women were led to a washing area where they could change into their uniforms. Elizabeth stood under a stream of cold water, scrubbing days of salt and sweat from her skin. The water ran clear and steady. She had expected rationing, expected limited access, but the faucet didn't sputter or run dry. She washed slowly, savoring the feeling of being clean. When she dressed in the camp uniform, she felt the weight of finality settle over her. She was no longer just Elizabeth. She was prisoner 4127, a number in a foreign system far from home. The first meal came an hour later. The women were led to a dining hall, where tables were arranged in rows. Staff moved along a serving line, placing food onto metal trays. Elizabeth watched the woman in front of her receive bread, butter, boiled carrots, potatoes, and a piece of cooked meat. When her turn came, she held out her tray and received the same portions. She carried the tray to a table and sat down. For a moment, she just stared at the food. The bread was soft and white, nothing like the dense, gritty loaves she had eaten for the past 2 years. The butter was real, not margarine or lard. The vegetables were cooked, but still held their shape and color. She took a bite of the bread and had to stop. The taste was so familiar, so tied to memories of life before the war, that it brought tears to her eyes. She chewed slowly, forcing herself not to cry. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Some ate in silence, afraid to show emotion. Others wept quietly into their hands. The meal wasn't elaborate, but it was real. It was whole. It was more than they had seen in years, and it drove home a truth none of them wanted to face. If this was how prisoners ate in America, then Germany had been starving long before the end. After the meal, the women were assigned to barracks. Elizabeth walked into a long, narrow building lined with bunk beds. A small stove stood in the center, and shelves along the walls held personal storage. She chose a lower bunk near the back, placed her bedding on the thin mattress, and sat down. The room smelled of wood and dust. It was cold but dry. Outside, the camp lights flickered on as evening fell. Elizabeth lay back on the bunk and stared at the ceiling. She could hear the breathing of other women, the creak of bed frames, the distant sound of a guard's boots on gravel. For the first time in weeks, the night held steady. No explosions split the sky, no sirens clawed at her nerves, No shouted orders pushed her toward panic. Elizabeth lay still on her bunk and felt the strange comfort of safety settling over her. It was almost painful. The simple absence of fear reminded her how thoroughly terror had shaped her life. She realized she had lost more than a war. She had lost the world that existed before it. Camp life had a rhythm she had nearly forgotten how to follow. Wake at 6, wash in cold water, eat a meal that always arrived on time, report for work, stop at noon, work again until late afternoon, eat dinner, rest until lights out. The schedule was posted outside the barracks, crisp and unchanged. Predictability felt foreign. In Germany, routine had collapsed under bombs, shortages, and uncertainty. Here, it held firm, day after day. Elizabeth was assigned to the sewing room. Because she had mended uniforms before, she took naturally to the work, patching jackets, replacing buttons, strengthening seams. 6 women worked together under one guard, who watched but did not hover. When he asked whether a garment could be saved, she could tell he wanted real answers. That sliver of trust startled her. It had been years since anyone had looked at her as someone whose opinion mattered. The sewing machines worked. The supplies lasted. When something broke, it was replaced instead of hoarded. Elizabeth noted each detail quietly. The Americans had resources that simply arrived, as if the system behind them never faltered. Meals continued to surprise her. 3 times a day the kitchen served food that was plain but filling. Potatoes, vegetables, bread, beans, sometimes meat. The portions never shrank. Flour, butter, and canned goods stayed in steady supply. It was not indulgence, it was infrastructure, the kind her own country no longer possessed. Evenings softened the edges of captivity. Some women played cards. Others read from a rolling cart of books. Elizabeth wrote letters. The censors read them, so she avoided emotional truths. She told her mother she was healthy, working, fed. She wrote nothing of guilt or confusion or gratitude she barely understood. The guards gradually became more familiar. None were cruel. Some had stiff manners. Some made quiet jokes. Some offered small kindnesses like holding open a door when her arms were full. They were young, far from home, and doing a job that placed them in charge of women they had once been told to fear. Over time, the idea of enemy faded into something more human. She tasted cornbread for the first time one afternoon, a dense golden square that smelled slightly sweet. It was unlike anything she knew, bread and cake at once. She learned later that Americans made it from cornmeal, using an ingredient her homeland reserved mostly for animals. Another quiet reminder of differences in abundance. Letters from home were rare. When one finally came from her mother, Elizabeth read it alone, tears slipping unbidden. Her mother wrote of damage, scarcity, and loss, but also of pride that her daughter was safe. Elizabeth folded the letter under her pillow, a fragile link to a world that felt both familiar and impossibly far. As weeks passed, the constant fear that had once ruled her began to loosen. She still worried, still missed home, but she no longer flinched at night. Predictability gave her room to think, room to grieve, room to understand the scale of what had happened to her country. One evening she stood outside beneath a sky unbroken by searchlights. The stars were the same as in Germany, but the silence below them was different. No bombers, no rumble of distant guns, just the hum of a camp that functioned smoothly even in wartime. She realized then that Germany had lost long before it admitted defeat, not because its soldiers lacked will, but because its systems had collapsed while America's held steady. News of surrender came slowly through official notices. The war was over. Relief and grief twisted through the sewing room as women froze mid-stitch. Home waited somewhere across an ocean, But what version of home? Repatriation took months. Paperwork, transport, waiting. When Elizabeth's name finally appeared on the list, fear and hope rose together. She traveled by bus, train, and ship until she reached German soil again. The sight staggered her. Bombed buildings, cratered streets, weary faces. Her own town lay half-ruined. Yet her mother's embrace was whole, and for a moment that was enough. In the years that followed, Elizabeth rarely spoke of her time in America. Not because she wanted to forget, but because comfort felt like something she could not justify. Still, she remembered the bread, the routines, the decency, the quiet nights without sirens. She carried those memories silently. She also remembered the strange mixture of emotions that had lived inside her during those months. The relief that came from safety, the guilt that followed it, and the steady amazement at how a nation fighting a global war could still keep its routines intact. Sometimes she lay awake wondering what her life might have become if she had been raised in a place where structure was ordinary instead of miraculous. She wondered whether the guards ever thought of the prisoners afterward, or if the small details stayed with her always.